We come to Romans chapter 6. It's a heavy passage. In fact, I've been saying this, that throughout this year we are doing these promises of God, and I took all these promises of God, I mixed them up, randomly pulled them out, at least randomly from my point of view. Asked God that He would not make them random, that they would be part of His plan. Periodically we've come to where I pulled two out, and they're from the same, two in a row from the same chapter. And this is going to happen this week and next week, that I pulled two from Romans chapter 6. Again, this happened earlier in the series. It did in the opposite order that I would ever preach it. I would always do the first beginning of the chapter at the beginning, and the end of the chapter at the end. God didn't want me to pull them in that order, I guess. I pulled them in backwards order. So we're going to start with the end of the chapter. Next week we're going to come to the beginning. It's confusing, right? Oh well, we'll go with it. I got to be honest with you, I've got these two that are coming up that are very much connected, very similar in theme, and both really heavy. Really heavy. So we're going to try to have some fun with a very heavy passage, I guess, this week. They're passages that have to do very much with our identity. Moving from an identity of failure, an identity of struggle, an identity of sin, to one where we have an identity that God created us to have. That God originally intended for us, and it is glorious. Back in March of 2005, in the Fraser Valley near Abbotsford in BC, there was a nursing home there, and as happens in nursing homes, one of the residents passed away that night. Somebody who shared a room with somebody else, they came in, found this lady had passed away during the night. They contacted facilities come, they decided to transport her to the hospital, to the morgue there in Abbotsford. The driver came and picked her up, brought her away. A little while later, the staff came in to check on the other lady who was in the room, and they discovered the deceased was there. The other lady, who tended to sleep really heavy, was gone. All of a sudden, alarm bells are going off in their heads, thinking, did they grab the wrong lady? Well, by the time they got around to phoning, you can imagine the surprise in the hospital when all of a sudden the deceased woke up that morning. In fact, it was much more concerning for the deceased, who was waking up in a place that she did not recognize and was very confused. They had carried off the wrong 87-year-old. You know what? We move from death to life. That's the whole promise of Christianity. At first glance, we look at our lives, and we look at other Christian lives, and we may appear a lot like the world. But boy, there is a big difference between those who are connected with Jesus and those who are not. There's hope for us. And it is important to understand our identity and see ourselves as the ones who are alive in Jesus. Paul, in this letter of Romans, so Romans is a letter, he's writing to a group of people in the city of Rome. He writes this letter, and it is the basics of the Christian faith. It's what it's all about. You are a sinner, but in the eyes of God you are holy. You fail, but in the eyes of God you are victorious. You are dead in your sin, but in the eyes of God, you are alive in hope. That's the basis of the book of Romans. It is a promise of God that I am righteous and that I am free from sin when I know Jesus. Sin, in our passage, is described as slavery. One may not even realize they're caught up in slavery. When I was going through this passage and thinking about the way it's going to describe itself, that we are caught in this world of sin and not even sometimes always realizing how much we are. I'm thinking, that if you haven't seen this, don't worry about it. I'm not recommending it, but the 90s movie, The Matrix, it's about a bunch of people who don't even realize that they're slaves, who are caught up in a world that doesn't look anything like what they think it looks like. And they slowly discover the truth. That is kind of the parallel here. We live in a world not even understanding that we are slaves to sin. We live in a world that is different than the one that we think we live in. And yet, Jesus comes offering, saying, I created the world to be different. I created you to know my righteousness, to live a certain way, and I freed you to live that way. As the U.S. Civil War was coming to an end, the Confederate capital of Richmond, Virginia fell to the Union forces. And even though the battle had just ended, Abraham Lincoln insisted on going down to the city of Richmond right after it fell. And he went through with security all around him. And he didn't announce, nobody announced he was coming, but it didn't take long for people to start recognizing him. And very quickly, slaves, now freed, started to surround him. And an American naval admiral caught his impromptu speech and recorded it, in which he said, "My poor friends, you are free. Free as air. You can cast off the name of slave and trample on it. Liberty is now your birthright. Let the world see that you merit your freedom. Don't let your joy carry you to excesses. Learn the laws, obey them. In other words, you are completely free. Now go do what's right. Not because you're obliged, but because you follow the path of freedom." Romans chapter 6, verses 17 and 18. "But thanks be to God that you who were once slaves of sin have become obedient from the heart to the standard of teaching to which you are committed. And having been set free from sin, have become slaves of righteousness." We're going to mostly focus on the second half of that passage. I think we're going to start here with this standard of teaching. The standard of teaching. We live in a world that is fallen. We live in a world that is messed up. And because we are completely surrounded by it, that's how we understand the world. But our call is from God to another world. A world which we should be committed to through Jesus. We should see it as something different. See, the way we see this world is a worldview. Heard that back in high school social studies, a worldview? It's the way we see the world. It's almost like a template that is over the entire world, a rule over all the world. It's not a great way to explain what the Greek is trying to say here when it says a standard of teaching. But the basic idea of this is the way, when we're under sin, we see the world. But there's another way to see the world. It's God's way to see the world. There's a pattern of life we live. And we're to see the heavenly, godly standard as ours. To hold it in who we are. Got this word. Become obedient from the heart to the standard of teaching. Now, of course, you read that, we all should know. He's talking about the heart. He's not talking about the beating thing in our chest, right? When we talk about the heart, when we use English, what do we tend to be thinking when we talk about hearts? Well, we're talking about emotions, right? We might be talking about love. Might even be talking about romance. You know what? In the Greek language, which is the Bible language, the language the New Testament was written in, they didn't think of the heart as a place where things like emotions came from, where romance and love and all those things came. Would you believe this? I actually mentioned this before. Because it plays a role in the New Testament. They actually thought those things, they came from your intestines. Go figure. This is a different way of thinking about it. Emotions don't come from either, right? They probably actually more come from our mind and some of the other parts of our body. And nothing to do with either heart or intestines, I don't know. But the Greeks talked about the heart. They were thinking about something a little bit different than the seat of our emotions. I told you this would get heavy, but it's interesting, right? It's not the seat of our emotions. The heart really means something a little bit different. It's not about being impulsive or emotional or feelings. What's really meant by this is the heart had to do more with our thinking and thought patterns. Our thinking and thought patterns. And our thinking and thought patterns that kind of overarching us tend to play in the way we live. If you've got a sports team that comes out the dressing room right before a game and says, we're a bunch of losers, what's going to happen in the game? They're not going to do well. This sounds like the Oilers, doesn't it? They come to the ice, I'm automatically thinking, boy, this is going to be bad tonight. Every once in a while they do win. That's a way that thinking patterns affect who we are. Generally, if you've got a sports team, you're trying to get them pumped up. You're going to go out there. You are winners. You are going to be victorious. You are strong. You are good enough. You know, they tell yourself that over and over again. And you're going to go out and you're not always going to win. I mean, one team has to lose. But you're going to have a totally different way of approaching the game, thinking you could win versus thinking you're going to lose. I would play a National Hockey League team. I would probably go convinced I'm going to get, I'm going to lose pretty bad because I don't have that time. I'm going to convince myself of that, right? Goes for everything in life. I see myself and my place in this world as a failure. I've talked myself into it. I'm not good enough. I can't succeed at this. I can't overcome this. That's a thought pattern. It's a way of seeing the world. It is a standard of teaching that is wrong. Because Jesus comes and says, you know what? You don't have to be victorious. You just have to love me. You don't have to be good enough. You have to have faith in me. You don't have to be strong enough. You have to submit to the Holy Spirit. That's what's important. 1 Corinthians chapter 2. But we impart a secret and hidden wisdom of God, which God decreed before the ages for our glory. None of the rulers of this age understood this, for if they had, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. But as is written, what no eye has seen, nor ear heard, nor the heart of man imagined, what God has prepared for those who love him. These things God revealed to us through the Spirit, for the Spirit searches everything, even the depths of God. You know what? The world can't begin to imagine what God has for us. He has something greater for us. The feelings we feel, they're the most shallow part of us. God is at work in the deepest parts of us, changing us. He is at work in this very pattern of life, changing our thinking and bringing us to the glory of God. You're being set free from sin. Now right away, okay, so this happens. Our mindset changes, we're more walking away, we're set free from sin. First question everybody might want to ask, so why do I still sin? So why do I still sin? We're going to tackle that a little bit more next week as well. Sin is not just the things that I do that are wrong. It's not just an action. It's a pattern of life. It is a destructive way of life that leads to death and separation from God. To be free from the action of sin is great, but the promise of God is that I am free from this pattern of the world. We live in a world that's fallen, and we understand that world well. But our call is to that of a different world. I am free from the grip of sin. So if I'm free from that, why do I keep messing up? Is it because I don't really have the fullness of His salvation? Is it because I'm a failure as a Christian, because I missed the promise? I'm set free and yet I continue to act like a slave? Part of it is, I'm going to tell you, as long as we're on this earth, we're going to keep making mistakes. Partially to remind ourselves how badly we need Jesus. That's part of it. Because if I could do it right, I wouldn't need Jesus, would I? But to keep learning over and over again how desperately we need Jesus. I can get up here and tell you, do you know what? Don't sin anymore. From this day forward, just go out and be the perfect person. Is it going to work? No. Do you know why? Because me getting up and saying act right isn't the solution to humanity. Our solution is Jesus. We need to learn to rely on Jesus more and more. To go deeper into the... And do you know what? As you sin, sometimes we mess up and we feel, oh man, I messed up. I can't go to God anymore. I should skip my Bible reading today. Maybe I'm too guilty to go to church. Do you know what? Those things actually should be reminding us and driving us towards Jesus, not away from Him. You mess up, Jesus might be using that as a reminder to you to go to Him, not run away. We need Jesus. We need Him. But we do need to let our minds become more like Him. Romans 12 says, do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable, perfect. We need to run to Jesus. Sometimes, we think about our Bibles, and our Bibles are there somewhere, and we pick up our Bibles, and sometimes we might read them, get confused by them, and maybe put them away on the shelf then for a while. We have an unfortunate name for picking up the Bible and praying sometimes. We call it sometimes devotions. I'm going to tell you why that is not a great name. That's an English word. It's not from the Bible. The reason is because people look at it and think, well, maybe if I just pick up my Bible and I pray every once in a while, it will show that I am devoted to God. It will prove that I am devoted to Him and is proving myself to God. And maybe God will bless me because I've proven my devotion to Him. So Bible reading becomes something that exists for God's sake. It makes Him happy. Middle Ages, the church came up with this idea that maybe recite this prayer so many times and God will be happy with you because you've recited this prayer so many times. Well, sometimes in the evangelical church, we think, well, if I can just get away with reading my chapter a day and saying a quick prayer, that's what God wants of me, and I made Him happy and I've proven my devotion to Him. That's not at all what it is. We should be running to our Bibles and running to prayer because it's an opportunity to meet Jesus. To actually sit down with Him. It's not for His sake, it's for ours. It's for our good. And when we don't always understand the Bible, it's because we're not coming to it prayerfully. Asking God to reveal Himself in the Bible. To change me because I've come to Him today. I'm praying that because I read the Bible, the world around me might be different. God is at work in those incredible... We need to become people who are set free from sin. Not to become perfect, but set free from these ideas of these lies that sin tells us. And listen to God to become more like Him. There needs to be this break with the world. There's a story of a gentleman by the name of Lee Nailing. He lived in the 1800s, 1870s, somewhere in there where he was a kid. At that time, it was a tough time. He lived in New York City. His mom died when he was quite young. His dad couldn't handle him. His dad fell apart when his mom died, turned to alcohol. Everything fell apart. He became a cruel person. Eventually, they came and they put Lee and his brothers in an orphanage. Dad still had some contact with him, but he started growing up for a little bit in an orphanage. Around that time in the United States, happened in Canada as well, they decided that, well, what we should do with orphans from the east is send them to the west so they can work out in the west, settle the west. Lee and a couple of brothers got taken to the train station. Dad came along with him, handed him an envelope and said, "This is my contact information. When you get settled, keep in touch. Let me know where you're at. This is how you get a hold of me." They went, they got on the train. Lee stuck that envelope in his pocket and became one of 200,000 orphans who over the decades got sent to the west. Basically what would happen, these trains would set out towards the west. They would stop in each town. If somebody was interested in taking in an orphan to work on their farm or to work wherever, they would go to the train station, they would meet it, they would go on to the cars, they would look at all the kids, they would pick somebody. Sounds crazy, doesn't it? Soon after leaving New York City, Lee fell asleep on this train. He woke up, he got up, kind of stretched, walked around, went back to his compartment and realized the envelope from his dad with his contact information was gone. Didn't have it. Didn't have it. You know, it kind of reminds me of how sometimes we think of the Christian life, that we may break free from sin, and it's like this kid. Well, all of a sudden, he leaves New York City as an orphan. And now he has no connection back to his old life. Now that no connection's okay, but that can't be the end of the story, can it? Just all of a sudden you've got a kid who now has no contact with his family anymore. I mean, sometimes we think that God is calling us just to leave sin. But you know what? There's more to the story. That God is taking us somewhere dramatic. He's bringing us closer to things of Jesus. And we may not like the term slaves of righteousness because that word slave in there doesn't sound so good. But God is taking us somewhere. Slave is odd in our language. It's learning to desire to be righteous. Righteous is not just that I've left sin behind. Righteous is that I'm doing the things of God. Sin is not what we are to want. We're to see ourselves as different. The good news of this story that I started to tell is there is more to the story. It's not just that he broke from an old life. The rest of the story actually starts pretty hard, that they go along, they come to one stop, one of Lee's brothers gets selected. He goes off. He actually never sees that brother again. They go a few more stops. Somebody gets on the train, looks at the two boys, Lee and his brother, and says, "Come with me." They get off the train. They spend a few days there. This family that they were with looks and finally says, "Do you know what? We don't really have space or food for two boys. We're going to put one of you back on the train." They take Lee and they put him back on the train. He goes to the next stop. Somebody walks along and says, "You come with me." This time he gets off, they go to this big farm, and he says, "Okay, you're to look after the farm. I want you to look after all the animals." Go to bed, get up early, go look after the... That's all he says. Now, keep in mind, where I say this kid's from, he's from New York City. Gets up and he has to look after... He's never seen a chicken in his life, and he's in charge of the chickens. Never seen chicken in his life. Doesn't do very well. There are a couple of days and they put him back on the train again. Goes a couple stops, somebody comes on the train, waves at him, come with me. At this point, guess where this kid's confidence is? This is how he's feeling. He's lost 2 brothers, he's been in a couple of homes. He's going through the Texas countryside. Next family, it's late at night. They say, go to bed. We're going to get up in the morning. He goes to bed. He's lying there thinking, this is not going to last. We're going to get up in the morning. I'm going to grab some food. As soon as they've turned their back, I'm going to take all the food I can find and run. Family's names were the Nailings. He says he got up that morning. There was some food there. He started to grab for food. I'm going to read a little bit of what he wrote. Mrs. Nailing stopped me as he starts to grab food. Not until we have said grace, she explained. I watched as they bowed their heads. Mrs. Nailing began speaking softly to our father, thanking him for food and the beautiful day. I knew something about God, enough about that our Father, because that was something that occasionally some preacher would show up at the orphanage and pray a blessing of our Father who art in heaven over us orphans. But I couldn't understand why she was talking to him as though he were sitting, waiting with us to share in our breakfast. I began to squirm a little in my seat. Then Mrs. Nailing thanked God for the privilege of raising a son. I looked up at her and she began to smile. She called me a privilege. I looked over, Mr. Nailing must have agreed with her because he began to smile too. For the first time since I boarded the train, I actually began to relax. A strange, warm feeling began to fill my aloneness. And I looked at an empty chair beside me and began to think that maybe in some mysterious way this Our Father was seated there and he was listening to the next softly spoken words. Help us to make right choices as we guide him, and help him to make the right choices too. Suddenly I heard Mr. Nailing say to me, dig in, son. I was startled. I hadn't even noticed the amen. My mind had stopped at the choices part. As I ate my plate, I thought about that. Hate, anger, and running away had seemed to be my only choices. Maybe there were others. This Mr. Nailing didn't seem so bad, and this thing about having Our Father to talk to shook me up for a little. I ate in silence. After breakfast, as they walked me to the barber shop for a haircut, we stopped at exactly 6 houses along the way. Each time the Nailings introduced me as our new son. As we left the last house, I knew that at first light the next day, I would not be running away. There was a hominess here that I'd never known before. At least I could choose to give it a try. Or something else. Although I did not know where Papa was or how I could ever write to him, I had the strong feeling that I had found not one, but 2 new fathers. And I could talk to both of them. That's exactly the way it turned out. See, it's not just about breaking the past old patterns of sin. It's about coming to this loving Father. We have to consider who we are. If I put on a hockey jersey, it indicates a lot about who I am, right? Put on an Oilers jersey, everybody can figure out, oh, I cheer for the Oilers even though they can't ever win. I gotta tell you, if you gave me a Flames jersey, I would have a lot of trouble putting it on. I would struggle with it because that's not who I am. This is about something deeper, but it's about considering that this is who you are. Not just the jersey you wear, but it's about something deeper, more glorious. I am God's child, and that is how I will live, and I will declare that that is who I am, and that I will learn to live that way by learning to love and appreciate the fact that He loves me, that He has chosen me, He is at work in my life, and do you know what? Just as much as I'm called on to loudly declare that I'm on His side, He loudly declares that I'm His child. I need to see myself as His child. So this whole call about being obedient, this heart of standard, it's all about moving from one camp to another. To turn your back, okay, we used to live in this way of life, we used to live over, now I'm just focused here. And while this world may still be where I am, and I may still have moments where I mess up, it's not who I am. Because Jesus is at work in my lives, and I turn fully to Jesus. We're going to take a moment, we're going to sing about turning fully to Jesus. I'm going to invite our worship team to come forward. So we sing hymn number 332, Turn Your Eyes Upon Jesus.